What do you think are some of the most important protests just in history?
Oh goodness. Some of the most important protests, I would say BLM 2020 definitely in my lifetime, because it was just, I think, an awakening for so many people that refused to look and see that racism was still in America and still in the world globally, because BLM went global with their protesting.
I feel like some of the most important and landmark protests that we've seen specifically here in the US have been ones that were taking place with civil rights back when Jim Crow laws were in place.
I think another one that made a huge change was Stonewall, because after Stonewall, in my opinion, Stonewall was the first recognized protest for the LGBTQ plus community. And so after that, a lot of organizations got started, a lot of resources became available, a lot of things started to move forward that hadn't moved forward.
Europe, there's still multiple protests going on in Poland about the idealization of gay marriage.
Only the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing, China.
It was the Boston Tea Party.
Women's suffrage parade in 1913.
I feel like in this modern day and age, every single protest is getting more and more important because of the amount of media that we now have. So my name is Susanna Hansel. I'm a member of United Campus Workers of Kentucky on this campus, and I'm also a TA in the Department of Modern and Classical Literatures, Languages, and Cultures.
Introduce yourself and what organization you're part of.
So my name is Madison Roark. I'm 23 years old. I'm an elementary education major at the University of Kentucky. I'm currently student teaching, and I'm from London, Kentucky, which is in Eastern Kentucky. It's kind of at the beginning of Eastern Kentucky.
What organizations are you part of?
Some organizations I'm a part of. I'm Vice President of Recruiting for the Elementary Education Student Association. I am the event coordinator for the Feminist Alliance on campus. And then I am on the executive board for the Sun Up Initiative, which is based in Corbin, Kentucky.
Yeah.
Okay. And what are your opinions on protests?
I feel like protests, especially in the year 2020, really hit mainstream news. And I feel like they are necessary building blocks to bring change into this country and our culture. And I feel like as long as they are not actively very violent, they are great ways to have the building blocks and get news coverage. So feeling very pro at the moment of them.
What are your opinions on protests? And also when we say protests, it's very anything related to protests, like vigils, anything like that.
So I've actually put on vigils before and helped coordinate protests. I've been to a lot of protests. I think protests are a way to get opinions across to the legislature without having to call your senator, because a lot of the time when you call your senator, you're calling an intern. And so it doesn't really directly get to that senator, versus if you're doing a protest, it gets attention more because it's happening in a community and it's getting a lot of public attention, community attention, and so they'll eventually.
And when was the last time you attended a protest, and what was it?
So I took part in a teach-in on the campus of the University of Kentucky, and that is the last protest I took part in. Due to COVID, protests were considered not as much of a great place for me to be in as of last year, but the teach-in, it was basically just a protest of us having an educational time to talk with fellow graduate students, professors, and other people at the university to talk about what we believe are inequalities, which I believe is a huge part of protests in themselves.
Hear about it.
When was the last time you attended a protest, and what was it?
They had a protest in October. I want to say it was the 2nd, but I'm not for sure on the day. I don't remember. but it was for reproductive rights for women after what happened in Texas.
Okay. When do you believe a protest goes too far?
I believe a protest goes too far when there is unnatural amounts of force being applied to protesters. Some of the videos that came out of last year of tear gas attacks at protests, those were inordinately violent, and that was not on the part of the protesters. But seeing protesters have to literally kick cans of gas spray away from them, just like on a daily basis, was insane. And also when curfews were being put into major cities because of it. So I feel like whenever there is too much force being put on people who are just trying to want change, that's when it gets to be a little bit too far. And not on the part of the protesters, on the part of the people who are trying to stop protesters.
When do you believe a protest goes too far?
So I think when I answer this question, it's important to say and like recognize the privilege I have in answering that, because I'm white. So when a protest goes too far for like me is I'm defacing public property. I really have no reason to do that because my rights aren't being infringed. I can protest all day and I can do what I need to do, but at the same time, I don't have the same right to like deface something. Now I know that with BLM, media kind of castrated like a light that it was violent. They kind of tried to frame it in the media like they framed Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, which was negative, and to kind of get a certain type of person to look at it as protests are bad, and that's why a lot of protest bans are happening in America right now. I think the riots that happened in May of 2020.
Are there any alternatives to protests that you feel are more or the same level of importance for change?
I feel like teach-ins at the university level are on the same level and are just as important as protests being done actively, because teach-ins, it's a panel and it's just the panelists sitting there and answering questions and having a Q&A session, which has the same goals as a protest, but it is more controlled and it's a better alternative to likely have those same goals come out of it.
So what got you interested in politics and or social issues?
So as a person that grew up in suburban Atlanta, I grew up in a high school that was very homogenous. And when I moved to college, I came into an area of South Carolina that was not very homogenous. And also within my undergrad, there was a lot of political talk. I was in theater for all 4 years of my undergrad, so theater is inherently political. And then being a part of German departments, there tend to be a lot of politics talk in there because of the history of German. So just coming to undergrad, seeing all these different viewpoints and seeing all these leftist liberal viewpoints being put into my studies really helped me with discovering the side of politics that I really lied on.
What got you interested in politics and social issues? I think you already answered this question, but yeah.
No, it's okay. So I'm from a very small town in eastern Kentucky, and it's very, very conservative. It's kind of known in Kentucky as like Trump country, and it got that name after Trump was elected into office. But I was in high school when Trump got in, and it's always been very Republican. You don't really like think anything different than the way you were raised, really. I had the privilege of being raised by a dad who was a Democrat. Not to make that political or like one side's whatever, but I was raised in the light to like look at things differently, and I had a different perspective when I went home than when I went to school. I only got into politics when it had to, early on, when it was dealing with women's rights, because I had an instance in when I came forward with a story about a male and I wasn't believed. And I got harassed. I still get harassed by this person, but still it's like, it's never, no evidence, no nothing is ever enough to be believed. And so that's when I was like, oh my goodness, all these women standing up and hashtagging me too, because that's the movement that was big at that point. I was like, they're telling the truth. Like, everything I'm hearing at school about them lying is a lie in itself. And so I really, really dug in, I think, to kind of handle my own trauma, dug into politics and learning everything I could about politics, about human rights, and about what I could do to kind of help that. So I think when the other side takes it too far in a protest is when it's a peaceful protest, people are sitting, people aren't disrupting traffic, and we're just shooting them with rubber bullets. Rubber bullets hurt. They hurt. So I just don't understand why that has to happen, and I don't understand beating the crap out of people to get your point across. There's different ways to get your point across versus beating the tar out of someone.
Okay. So, were there police presence at any protests that you have ever attended? What was their role, and did they make you feel safe?
I have never been to a protest where there have been police presences, because I didn't really understand protests before 2020, and obviously due to COVID, it was harder to go into maybe downtown Atlanta and go to these things. But from what I have seen, it's a mixed bag. There are some protests where the police are there exclusively to just keep the peace, but there are some protests where they're there that are almost agitating protesters and agitating people against the protesters. So, yeah.
Has there ever been police presence at any protest you have attended? And if there has, what was their role, and did they make you feel safe?
Yes. So, the police they had little presence at the women's rights movement before COVID. So I guess that would have been 2019. They do one downtown in Lexington. Their role was to protect, like, if protesters on the other perspective came to protest against us, they were kind of there to de-escalate any situation that were to occur.
What was the first protest you attended and why?
So the first protest that I truly attended was the teach-in here on the campus that a few of you went to. And it was because the topic of graduate labor is something that is not talked about in academia whatsoever. We are the face of classes that US students have to take here at UK, and we work our butts off to have good teaching, but we don't get the support from our departments in some departments. And yeah, so I just wanted to speak about my work conditions and all of that.
What was the first protest you've ever attended?
The first protest I ever attended was probably the women's rights movement when I first moved to Lexington, which would have been 2019.
How effective do you think protests are?
I feel like protests are effective in a way that they are ways to get media attention onto the issues that we would like to talk about, because the teach-in was not covered by many news departments, but when they held a protest with UCW here last year, as far as I know, there was a lot of media coverage associated with that. So, and I also feel like with protests, if it goes too far, that gets a lot more media coverage than anything else, and I feel like that happened a lot with BLM last year, so yeah.
How effective do you think protests are?
Oh, I think protests are really effective, and you can see that in laws that happen and change that happens. You can see that when your elected officials are on TV and they're like nervous. You can tell they've had a tough day. I'm like, I know what you've been watching. You've been seeing us protesting. So I think it makes a huge difference.
Should protests be political?
Protests should be inherently political, because protests, they are a political move, and it's something that is very much it's a more aggressive way than just like putting up posters and like having a teach-in. But sometimes to get the political movements that we want to have happen and to get the protections that we want for our fellow people in this country, we have to have protests.
Do you think protests should be political?
No, but they are. Like, they shouldn't be, and I hate to say that they are, but in my opinion, protests are made to be political. They shouldn't be. Human rights shouldn't be political. Human rights is a humanity issue. It's a human issue. It shouldn't have to be political. It shouldn't have to be, I know this, if I vote for this red president, that he's gonna not support women's rights. I shouldn't have to think that. I should just know when I'm voting for someone, human rights is never gonna be called into question by the president, by the Supreme Court, by anybody.